$50 and a rusted Winchester rifle. That was the going rate for a human soul in the winter of '88. Most folks look away when a father puts his own flesh and blood on the auction block, but up in the Bitterroot Range, desperation breeds a special kind of cruelty. They called her damaged goods, a silent, useless burden. But the man who bought her didn't want a slave. He just wanted the quiet to mean something else. Cold wind whipped through the muddy thoroughfare of Oakhaven, carrying the stench of wet horsehair and cheap whiskey. Graham Shaw kept his collar turned up against the biting chill. He hadn't been down the mountain in 3 months, and the noise of the settlement grated against his nerves. It was a dying boomtown, clinging to the edge of the frontier like a tick on a starving dog. Men shouted, wagons creaked, pianos banged out off-key saloon tunes. Graham hated every second of it. He loaded 50 pounds of flour, 2 sacks of coffee, and a crate of ammunition into the back of his wagon. His mule, a scarred, foul-tempered beast named Barnaby, stamped a hoof in the freezing mud. Graham tightened the cinch, ready to leave. Then he heard the shouting. It wasn't the usual drunken brawl, it was a sharp, nasal ranting, cutting through the ambient noise of the street. Graham turned. Outside the livery, a crowd had formed. In the center stood a man with hollow cheeks and a frantic, hungry look in his eyes. He gripped the wrist of a young woman. She was small, swimming in a wool coat 3 sizes too large, its hem caked in frozen mud. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark brown, hiding her face. She didn't fight the man's grip. She just stood there, perfectly still. "I'm telling you, she can work!" the man hollered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "She's strong enough for washing, cooking, whatever you need. Ain't gonna cost you much." A miner with a missing front tooth spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Jed, you can't sell your own daughter like a mule. Besides, the girl's broken. Ain't said a word since the fever took your wife." "She ain't broken!" Jed jerked her arm. She stumbled forward but caught her balance. Not a sound escaped her. "She's just quiet. And I got 3 other mouths to feed. $20. Someone give me $20 and she's yours." Disgust rolled through Graham's gut. He turned back to his wagon. It wasn't his business. The frontier was full of tragedies. A man survived by keeping his eyes forward and his rifle clean. He grabbed the reins. $10 then! Jed's voice cracked. Panic set in. 5! Christ almighty, just take her off my hands! If none of you take her, I'm leaving her on the trail. I can't afford the bread. Graham paused. He looked back at the girl. The wind blew her hair back, revealing her face. She was pale, her cheeks hollowed by the same hunger eating at her father, but her eyes were startlingly clear. They were a pale, striking blue, scanning the crowd not with fear, but with a cold, resigned calculation. She knew exactly what was happening. She had accepted it. There was no terror in her expression, only a profound, heartbreaking emptiness. Graham remembered a stray dog he'd found caught in a bear trap 3 winters ago. It had the same look, exhausted, waiting for the end. A burly man in a bowler hat stepped forward. He ran a filthy hand over his jaw. $5, you say? Well, she might be good for warming a bed, if nothing else. He reached out to touch her face. Before he could make contact, a heavy leather boot crunched into the icy mud between them. The man in the bowler hat looked up, his sneer faltering at the sight of the towering figure in the buffalo hide coat. Graham stood 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the weak winter sun. His beard was thick, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his Stetson, and his hand rested casually on the handle of the Colt strapped to his thigh. "Back away," Graham said. His voice was a low rumble, quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of a threat. The man backed up, raising his hands. "No trouble, mister. Just looking." Graham turned his gaze to Jed. The father swallowed hard, shrinking under the intense scrutiny. $50, Graham said. Jed blinked. "What?" Graham reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it into the mud at Jed's boots. It hit the ground with a heavy metallic clink. $50, and the Winchester strapped to my saddle. You take it. You go back to your other children, and you forget you ever had a daughter. Jed dropped to his knees, clawing at the pouch. He didn't even look at the girl. Deal. Yes, sir. A deal. Graham looked at the young woman. Get in the wagon. She stared at him. Her blue eyes searched his face, looking for the trap. Finding none, she moved. She didn't look back at her father. She climbed onto the wooden bench of the wagon, folded her hands in her lap, and stared straight ahead. Graham unspooled his rifle from the scabbard, tossed it onto the dirt next to the groveling man, and climbed up beside her. He snapped the reins. Barnaby grunted, leaning into the harness, and the wagon rolled out of Oakhaven. They didn't stop until the town was a mere smudge of grey smoke against the horizon. The ascent into the Bitterroots was brutal. The trail narrowed, twisting upward through dense stands of lodgepole pine and jagged granite outcroppings. The temperature plummeted with every 100 feet of elevation. Graham didn't try to make conversation. He knew better. You don't corner a frightened animal, and you don't demand words from someone who has locked them away. He focused on driving the mule, keeping the wagon from slipping off the icy edge of the switchbacks. Beside him she sat rigid. Her coat was wholly inadequate for the mountain chill. Graham watched from the corner of his eye as she began to shiver. Her teeth clicked together softly, but she made no move to pull her thin collar tighter or ask for warmth. She was punishing herself. Or perhaps she just didn't believe she deserved comfort. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever and reached into the back of the wagon. He pulled out a heavy, tanned bearskin blanket. Without a word, he draped it over her shoulders. She flinched violently at his movement, shrinking away as if expecting a blow. Graham froze. He kept his hands in plain sight, resting them back on his knees. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He just waited until her breathing slowed. Slowly, cautiously, her fingers crept up to clutch the edges of the heavy fur. She pulled it tight against her throat. The thick hide immediately trapped the heat. The violent shaking of her shoulders began to subside. She looked at him from beneath the fur, a silent, questioning gaze. It gets colder higher up, he stated flatly. He picked up the reins again. The silence between them was immense, mirroring the vast, empty expanse of the wilderness around them. For Graham, silence was an old friend. He had moved up the mountain 5 years ago to escape the endless noise of humanity. The war had left him with a head full of screaming men and booming cannons. The quiet of the pines was the only medicine that worked. But her silence was different. His was a chosen solitude. Hers was a fortress built under siege. They rode for another 3 hours as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The air turned brittle. Finally the trees broke, revealing a small clearing nestled against a sheer rock wall. A sturdy log cabin sat in the center, smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. Graham pulled the wagon to a halt. "We're here." He climbed down and went to help her. She ignored his outstretched hand, sliding off the bench on her own. Her legs wobbled as they hit the ground, stiff from the cold and the ride, but she caught herself against the wagon wheel. She'd refused to show weakness. Graham nodded once, acknowledging her independence. "Go inside. Door's unlocked. Fire's banked, but it'll be warm." He began unhitching Barnaby. She hesitated, looking at the cabin, then back at him. She was waiting for instructions, a chore to do, a price to pay. "Go," he repeated softly, gesturing with a tilt of his head towards the door. "I'll handle the mule." She turned and walked slowly towards the cabin. When Graham finished feeding and stalling Barnaby in the adjacent lean-to, he carried the supplies inside. The cabin was dimly lit by the embers in the hearth. She was standing perfectly still in the center of the room, still wrapped in the bearskin. She hadn't touched anything. She hadn't even moved towards the fire. He set the flour down heavily on the rough-hewn table. He struck a match, lighting the kerosene lamp hanging from the central beam. Yellow light flooded the room, revealing the Spartan interior: a cast-iron stove, a single bed in the corner, a rocking chair, and shelves lined with preserved food and books. He walked to the stove, tossed in 3 split logs, and stirred the coals. Flames caught instantly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "You can take the coat off," he said, turning to her. "It's warm enough now." She didn't move. He pulled up a heavy wooden chair and set it near the stove. "Sit." She approached the chair like it was a trap. She sat down on the very edge, her spine ramrod straight. Graham went about his routine. He filled a kettle from the water barrel, set it on the stove, and began pulling dried venison and biscuits from his pack. He moved with practiced, economic motions. He didn't hover over her. He didn't stare. He gave her the one thing she likely hadn't had in years: space. He put a tin plate of food on the table, poured a mug of hot coffee, and slid them to the side opposite his own. He sat down and began to eat. She watched him. He didn't look up. After 10 minutes, hunger won out over caution. She rose, moved to the table, and took the seat. She ate quickly, efficiently, keeping one eye on his movements. When she finished, she stood and reached for his empty plate, intending to clean it. Graham caught her wrist. The contact was sudden. She gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air, and yanked her arm back, her eyes wide with terror. She backed up against the log wall, her chest heaving. Graham cursed himself. He kept his hands flat on the table. "I wash my own plates," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You don't have to serve me. You aren't a maid. You aren't a slave." She stared at him, bewildered. If she wasn't here to work, why was she here? "There's water in the basin," he said, pointing to the washstand. "Fresh towel on the peg. Bed is yours." Her brow furrowed in confusion. She pointed to the single bed in the corner, then pointed to him. "I have a bedroll," Graham said, pointing to a thick canvas bundle strapped to his pack. "I prefer the floor. Better for my back." It was a lie. His back ached constantly from the hard ground, but he wouldn't let her sleep on the floor. She shook her head, gesturing to the floor, then to herself. "I bought you," Graham said. The harsh words made her flinch, but he had to make the point. "That means I make the rules. Rule 1, you sleep in the bed." She held his gaze for a long moment. Finally, the fight drained out of her. She nodded once. The first 2 weeks were a strange, silent dance. They moved around each other in the small cabin like 2 feral cats, constantly aware of the other's location, careful not to cross invisible boundaries. Graham learned her rhythms. She woke before dawn. She made the coffee. She didn't like the dark, always ensuring the lamp was lit the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. She flinched at sudden noises, a log popping in the fire, the wind slamming against the shutters. But she never made a sound herself. No cries, no sighs, no tears. She learned his rhythms, too. He chopped wood for 2 hours every morning. He cleaned his rifle every Sunday. He read books by the fire at night. He never raised his voice, and he never, ever reached for her again. The tension between them didn't break. It merely stretched, thinning out until it became a fragile, transparent membrane of trust. The winter grew fierce. Blizzards hammered the mountain, burying the cabin under 4 feet of snow. They were entirely cut off from the world below. On the 15th day, a massive storm blew in. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the timber frame. Graham had been out near the tree line, trying to secure the roof of the lean-to before the worst of the snow hit. He came bursting through the door, covered head to toe in white, breathing hard. He slammed the heavy oak door shut against the gale and dropped the iron bar into place. He turned around and winced, leaning heavily against the door frame. She was standing by the stove. She saw the blood immediately. It was seeping through the heavy fabric of his trousers just above the knee. A jagged piece of corrugated tin from the lean-to roof had torn loose in the wind, slicing through the canvas and deep into the meat of his leg. Graham gritted his teeth, limping towards the table. "I'm fine," he growled, waving her off as she took a tentative step forward. "Just caught a piece of metal." He sank into the wooden chair, his face pale underneath the weathering. He reached down to pull the fabric away, but his hands were clumsy with cold. He fumbled with his hunting knife, trying to cut the pant leg, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. The knife clattered to the floor. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, fighting the encroaching blackness. When he opened them again, she was kneeling in front of him. She had picked up the knife. For a fraction of a second, his combat instincts flared. But she didn't look at his face. She kept her eyes on his leg. With quick, precise movements, she slit the fabric of his trousers from the tear up to the thigh, exposing the wound. It was deep, bleeding sluggishly but consistently. She stood, moving swiftly to the wash basin. She poured hot water from the kettle, grabbed a clean cloth, and retrieved a bottle of whiskey from the top shelf. She returned to him. She didn't ask for permission. She pressed a hand firmly against his good knee to keep him steady, uncorked the whiskey with her teeth, and poured it directly into the open gash. Graham bit down on a scream, his jaw muscles bulging. He gripped the edges of the wooden chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't move away. She worked quickly, cleaning the blood, packing the wound with clean gauze from his medical tin. Her hands were small, but remarkably strong and steady. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. As she wrapped a tight bandage around his thigh, securing the knot, Graham watched her face. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. There was a smudge of soot on her cheek. For the first time since he had seen her in the muddy street of Oakhaven, she looked alive. Focused. Present. She finished the knot, snipped the excess fabric, and sat back on her heels. She finally looked up at him. Her blue eyes searched his face, checking for signs of shock or pain. The wind screamed outside, battering the cabin walls. But inside, the silence was thick, heavy, and profound. Graham let out a long, ragged breath. He looked down at the expertly dressed wound, then back to her. He reached out slowly. She didn't flinch this time. He took the bloody cloth from her trembling hand and set it on the table. "Thank you," he said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper. She nodded. She made a motion to stand up and move away. "Wait." She froze, still kneeling on the rough floorboards between his boots. Graham looked at her. He stripped away the hardened shell he wore for the rest of the world. He let her see the exhaustion, the pain, the profound, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. "My name is Graham," he said quietly. He hadn't introduced himself. They had existed as man and girl for 2 weeks. "Graham Shaw." He pointed a calloused finger at his own chest. "Graham." She stared at him. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the moisture pooling in her eyes. Her throat worked. She swallowed hard, her mouth opening slightly. He waited. He didn't push. She closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean path through the soot. Her chest hitched. It was the physical effort of moving a boulder that had crushed her vocal cords for years. Her lips parted. A sound emerged. It was cracked, broken, little more than a rush of air over disused vocal folds. Then she tried again. "Gid Eon." It was a whisper, barely audible over the crackling fire. But in the quiet of the cabin, in the vast empty space of his isolated life, it sounded like thunder. Graham felt something crack open inside his chest, a dam breaking. Yeah, he whispered back, his own voice failing him. That's right. She opened her eyes, looking up at him. For the first time, she smiled. It was small, fragile, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Chantal, she whispered. She pointed a trembling finger at her own chest. Chantal. Graham nodded slowly, etching the sound of her voice into his memory. Chantal. Winter did not forgive weakness. By the second morning after the accident, the whiskey proved an insufficient defense against the filth of the rusted tin. Fever seized Graham in the dark hours before dawn. It came on like a freight train, rattling his heavy frame and soaking his canvas bedroll in a cold, rank sweat. He drifted in and out of a fiery delirium, his mind slipping backward. He wasn't in the Bitterroots anymore. He was back in the artillery-cratered mud of Petersburg, hearing the frantic screaming of dying horses and tasting the bitter copper of blood in his teeth. He thrashed against the phantom shrapnel. A cool, damp cloth pressed hard against his forehead, anchoring him to the present. Graham forced his eyes open. The cabin was cast in the dim grey light of a snow-choked morning. Chantal leaned over him. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, her hair tied back with a frayed piece of twine. She dipped a rag into a bowl of icy water, wrung it out, and pressed it against his burning neck. He tried to sit up. "Barnaby, the mule needs—" His voice was a dry rasp, barely more than sandpaper scraping over stone. Chantal pushed him back down. It didn't take much effort. His muscles felt like melted lead. She leveled a stern, uncompromising glare at him, her pale blue eyes flashing in the low light. "Done," she said. The word was gravelly, forced past vocal cords that hadn't fully remembered how to work, but it was clear. Graham blinked through the haze of fever. "Wood. Done." He stared at her. He listened to the fierce howling of the blizzard outside, rattling the heavy log walls. He looked at her hands. Her knuckles were scraped raw, bright red and weeping slightly from the blistering cold. She had braved the whiteout. She had taken his heavy, splitting maul, a tool meant for a man twice her size, and she had chopped enough firewood to keep them from freezing. She had crossed the treacherous, wind-scoured gap to the lean-to feed the foul-tempered mule. She had kept them alive while he fought ghosts in the dark. Graham sank back into the makeshift pillow of his saddlebags. He lacked the strength to argue. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the exhaustion. But for the first time since the fever took him, he didn't dream of the war. He dreamed of quiet blue eyes. For 3 days, the storm raged, and for 3 days, Chantal fought a war of her own against his infection. She fed the fire relentlessly. She boiled snow for water. When his temperature spiked to terrifying heights, she stripped away his heavy wool blankets and bathed his chest with freezing water until he stopped convulsing. When the shivering fits hit, she piled every pelt and coat they owned on top of him, sitting beside him, adding the heat of her own small body to the pile to force the cold out of his bones. She didn't sleep. She moved through the cabin with a grim, determined efficiency. Graham watched her through the cracked lens of his illness. He saw the sharp angle of her jaw tighten when she checked the inflamed edges of his wound. He saw her boil poultices of pine pitch and dried yarrow, applying the scalding paste to draw out the poison. She was no longer the hollow, broken girl standing in the frozen mud of Oakhaven. The mountain had stripped away the frail exterior, revealing the iron spine underneath. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Graham woke to the sound of absolute silence. The wind had stopped. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm, steady amber glow across the rough-hewn floorboards. He turned his head. Chantal was asleep in the wooden rocking chair beside his pallet. She was curled tightly upon herself, an old wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Deep purple shadows bruised the skin beneath her eyes. Her breathing was slow and even. Graham shifted his weight. His leg throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, but the agonizing, pulsing heat was gone. The skin around the bandage felt cool. He reached out, his thick, calloused hand moving slowly through the air. He hesitated, then let his fingers gently brush a stray lock of dark hair away from her face. Chantal stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, immediately snapping into focus. She sat up straight, instantly alert, checking him for signs of distress. "I'm all right," Graham murmured. His throat was terribly dry, but the madness was gone from his gaze. Fever broke. Chantal studied his face. She pressed the back of her small hand against his forehead, confirming his words. A profound wave of relief washed over her features, softening the harsh lines of exhaustion. She slumped back into the chair, letting out a long, shaky breath. "Water," she whispered, her voice rough. She stood, her legs trembling slightly from fatigue, and fetched a tin cup from the bucket. She knelt beside him, slipping an arm beneath his heavy shoulders to help him sit up. Graham drank deeply. The water tasted metallic and perfect. He pulled back from the cup and looked at her. Really looked at her. "You saved my life, Chantal," he said flatly. No dramatic flourishes, just a statement of fact. She lowered her gaze to the floorboards, tracing a groove in the wood with the toe of her boot. She didn't seek praise. She had merely done what survival demanded. "I owe you," he added. Chantal looked up sharply. She shook her head, a fierce, sudden movement. She pointed a raw, blistered finger at his chest, then pointed to the space around them. The cabin, the fire, the safety. "No," she said. It took effort, her chest heaving as she forced the sentence out. "You bought me, saved me. I pay my debt." Graham's jaw tightened. He reached out and wrapped his massive hand gently around her pointing finger, lowering it. "No debts, not between us. You understand? You aren't property. You're just—" "Chantal." She stared at his hand holding hers. The warmth of his skin seeped into her aching joints. Slowly she turned her hand over, letting her palm rest against his rough calluses. It was a tentative connection, as fragile as spun glass, but neither of them pulled away. Morning brought a blinding, brilliant clarity to the bitter roots. The blizzard had left 4 feet of fresh powder in its wake, burying the cabin up to the windowsills. Sunlight pierced the frost-rimed glass, cutting through the dusty air of the cabin like a knife. Graham sat on the edge of the bed, gritting his teeth. The transfer from his floor pallet to the mattress had been agonizing. His left leg felt stiff, the muscle tight and unforgiving around the knitting flesh. Chantal knelt before him, scissors in hand, cutting away the soiled bandages. The angry red streaks that had radiated from the gash were fading, replaced by the ugly yellow-purple blossoming of deep bruising. The wound itself was closed, sealed shut by the drawing power of the pine pitch and her relentless care. "It looks better," Graham grunted, leaning heavily on his good leg. Chantal nodded, concentrating on cleaning the edges with a rag soaked in boiled water. She worked with a delicate touch, her face inches from his knee. Graham looked down at her. He noted the way the morning light caught the subtle red undertones in her brown hair. He smelled the faint, clean scent of lye soap and wood smoke on her skin. It was a stark contrast to the smell of blood and sickness that had filled the cabin for days. She reached for a fresh roll of cotton gauze. As she leaned forward, her shoulder brushed against the inside of his thigh. Graham stiffened. A sudden, sharp jolt of awareness shot through him, completely unrelated to the pain of his injury. He gripped the edge of the mattress, forcing his breathing to remain steady. He had spent 5 years alone. He had forgotten the electric weight of human proximity, the gravity of a woman's touch. Chantal froze. She felt his muscles tense. Slowly she looked up. Their faces were painfully close. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, heavy with an unspoken, dangerous tension. Graham's dark eyes locked onto her pale blue ones. He saw the sudden flare of panic in her gaze, the instinctive flinch of a battered animal expecting a strike. He immediately relaxed his posture, loosening his grip on the bed frame. He leaned back slightly, giving her space. He would not be the monster she expected men to be. "Sorry," he muttered, looking away towards the window. Leg cramped. Chantal didn't move. She kept her eyes on his profile. The harsh lines of his jaw, the thick, unkempt beard, the brutal scar that jagged down the left side of his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his woolen union suit. She had seen him vulnerable. She had seen him broken and delirious. Yet he still carried a quiet, terrifying strength. She realized in that suspended moment that she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of the sudden, unfamiliar fluttering in her own chest. She went back to wrapping the bandage. She pulled the cotton tight, tying it off with practiced efficiency. "Done," she whispered. "Thank you." Graham grabbed his heavy oak walking stick from the bedside table. He stood, testing his weight. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but it held. He took a heavy, dragging step toward the stove. Chantal watched him limp across the room. He was a proud man, diminished by circumstance, but unbroken. She moved to the cast-iron stove, picked up the coffee pot, and poured 2 tin mugs. She walked over to him, holding out the black coffee. Graham took it. Their fingers brushed. The contact lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Sun's out," Graham observed, looking out the frost-covered window. The glare off the snow was blinding. "We'll need to dig a trench to the lean-to. Barnaby's probably kicking the slats out by now." Chantal took a sip of her coffee. The bitter, scalding liquid warmed her throat, making it easier to speak. She was practicing, working the rust out of her voice every day. "I dig," she said quietly. Graham looked at her, arching an eyebrow. "You chopped wood for 3 days. You barely weigh 100 pounds soaking wet. You're not digging out 4 feet of snow." "You can't walk." "I can shovel leaning on a stick," Graham countered stubbornly. Chantal set her mug down on the table with a sharp, definitive click. She crossed her arms over her chest, mimicking a stance she had seen him take a dozen times. She squared her small shoulders, looking up at him with a defiant, unyielding expression. "I dig," she repeated. Her voice held a newly discovered edge of steel. "You rest." Graham stared at her. The sheer audacity of this tiny, scarred woman ordering him around in his own cabin hit him squarely in the chest. He let out a low, rumbling sound. It took Chantal a second to realize what the sound was. He was laughing. It was a rusty, unused sound, deep and resonant, vibrating through the small space of the cabin. A genuine, unguarded laugh that transformed his entire face, erasing years of grim isolation. Chantal felt her own mouth twitch, the corners of her lips pulled upward. It felt strange, foreign on her face, but she couldn't stop it. A genuine smile broke across her features. "All right?" Graham relented, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. "You dig, but I'm watching from the porch with the rifle. Mountain lions get hungry after a blow like this." They spent the afternoon working in tandem. Chantal waded into the waist-deep drifts, wielding the heavy iron shovel. She threw the snow with a fierce, rhythmic energy, carving a path toward the lean-to. Graham sat on a wooden crate on the covered porch, his bad leg stretched out straight, the Winchester resting casually across his lap. He watched her work. The sun beat down, warming the freezing air. Chantal shed her heavy wool coat, working in just her cotton dress and a thick undershirt, her breath pluming in the cold air. She was strong, resilient. She reached the lean-to and opened the door. Barnaby let out a loud, obnoxious bray of complaint, sticking his ugly grey head out to inspect the trench. Chantal patted the mule's coarse nose, feeding him an apple she had saved from the root cellar. Graham watched the exchange. A strange, heavy sensation settled in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't the pain of his leg, and it wasn't hunger. It was a profound, terrifying realization. He didn't want the winter to end. If the snow melted, the passes would open. If the passes opened, the world would return. And if the world returned, he didn't know how he would ever let her go. Chantal turned away from the mule, leaning on the shovel handle. She looked back toward the cabin. She saw Graham sitting on the porch, watching her. Even from 30 yards away, she could feel the weight of his gaze. It didn't feel heavy or demanding. It felt like an anchor. She raised a mittened hand, giving him a small, awkward wave. Graham slowly raised his own hand in return. They were two broken things, stranded at the edge of the world, slowly realizing that maybe they didn't need fixing. Maybe they just needed each other to carry the pieces. Spring came to the Bitterroots not with a gentle thaw, but with violence. Ice groaned and shattered across the high lakes. The creeks swelled into brown, roaring monsters, tearing at the riverbanks and dragging ancient pines down into the valleys. The snowpack retreated, leaving behind acres of thick, sucking mud and the rotting smell of wet, decaying foliage. Graham stood on the porch, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. He watched the runoff carve deep trenches through the yard. His leg still carried a dull, heavy ache when the barometric pressure shifted, a permanent reminder of the tin that had bitten into his thigh. But he walked without the cane now. The brutal isolation of winter was breaking. The world was waking up. He dreaded it. From the lean-to, he heard a sound that made the tension in his jaw ease. Chantal was talking to the mule. She didn't whisper anymore. Her voice remained rough, carrying the raspy friction of dry leaves scraping over stone. But she used it. She spoke in short, deliberate sentences, measuring her words as if they cost her something. Right now, she was telling Barnaby he was a miserable, ungrateful beast, and she was feeding him a handful of scarce oats while she did it. Graham took a sip of his coffee. The bitter grounds settled in his teeth. Then Barnaby let out a sharp, warning bray. Graham set the mug down on the railing. His hand dropped instinctively to the heavy Colt strapped to his hip. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking an inch into the mud, his eyes scanning the tree line. A rider emerged from the dense stand of lodgepole pines. He was a prospector, judged by the pan strapped to his pack and the layer of grime caked into the deep lines of his face. His horse was a sway-backed roan, breathing hard, exhausted by the mud and the elevation. The man spotted the cabin, then spotted Graham standing in the yard. He pulled back on the reins, raising an empty hand in the universal gesture of parley. "Ho, the cabin!" The rider called out. His voice was entirely too loud, cracking the fragile peace of the clearing. Graham didn't move. He didn't offer a greeting. He just waited, a towering wall of hostility wrapped in buffalo hide. The rider walked his horse forward, stopping a respectful 20 yards away. He eyed Graham's stance, noting the hand hovering near the holster. "Name's Cobb. Coming over from the Coeur d'Alene side. Trails washed out near the ridge. Hoping I might buy a hot cup of coffee and a dry corner in your barn for the night." Graham stared at him. He didn't want this man here. He didn't want the smell of the boomtowns, the greed, the noise, invading his sanctuary. But mountain law was absolute. You didn't turn away a traveler in the spring mud. It was a death sentence. "You can use the lean-to," Graham said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "Firewood is chopped. Keep away from the mule. He bites." Cobb smiled, revealing a row of yellowed, uneven teeth. "Much obliged, mister. I got silver. I pay my way." He swung his leg over the saddle and slid to the ground, his boots squelching in the muck. As he turned to lead the horse toward the lean-to, the heavy timber door creaked open. Chantal stepped out into the daylight. She was carrying an empty tin bucket, her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of grease across her cheek. The sunlight caught the rich, dark tones of her hair. She froze when she saw the stranger. Cobb stopped in his tracks. His eyes widened, raking over her form. It was the same look the men in Oakhaven had given her. A look of assessment, a calculation of worth. Up here, in the middle of nowhere, a woman was rarer than a gold strike, and the sudden sight of one short-circuited the prospector's manners. "Well now," Cobb drawled, a slow, greasy grin spreading across his face. He wiped his dirty hand on his trousers. "You didn't say you had company. Good afternoon, little lady." Chantal didn't shrink back. Months ago, she would have cowered. She would have folded in on herself, making herself as small and invisible as possible. But she had chopped wood in a blizzard. She had fought back a fever that should have killed a man twice her size. The mountain had hardened her. She set the bucket down in the mud. She looked at Cobb with a stare as cold and flat as the frozen lakes above them. She didn't say a word. She just stepped off the porch and walked purposefully toward Graham, coming to a stop directly beside him. Not behind his back. Beside him. Graham felt the heat of her shoulder inches from his arm. His blood ran cold with a sudden protective fury. He took one step forward, putting himself slightly between Cobb and Chantal, his thumb resting casually on the hammer of his revolver. "The lean-to," Graham repeated. The words were quiet. Deadly. "The coffee is a nickel. You drink it in the barn. You don't come in the cabin." Cobb blinked, the threat cutting through his initial surprise. He looked at Graham's dead eyes, then at the gun. He swallowed hard, the greasy smile vanishing instantly. "Right, yes, sir," Cobb mumbled, grabbing the roan's reins tight. "No offense meant. The barn is just fine." He hurried the horse toward the shelter, keeping his head down. Graham stood rigidly in the mud until Cobb disappeared inside the lean-to. He waited until he heard the sound of the prospector unsaddling the horse. Only then did he let his hand drop from the iron at his hip. He looked down at Chantal. Her jaw was set, her blue eyes still locked on the barn. "Go inside," Graham said softly. She looked up at him. She didn't argue. She saw the storm brewing in his dark eyes. She picked up her bucket and went back into the cabin, closing the heavy door behind her. Graham stayed in the yard for a long time. He listened to the rushing water. The isolation was gone. The world had found a path to his door, and it brought its ugliness with it. Night fell, bringing a sharp chill that cut through the damp spring air. Cobb stayed in the lean-to. Graham made sure of it. He sat in the rocking chair by the stove, his Winchester resting across his knees. He didn't read. He didn't clean his gear. He simply watched the heavy iron latch on the front door. Chantal sat at the table, mending a tear in his heavy canvas coat. The rhythm of her needle punching through the tough fabric was the only sound in the cabin. The tension from the afternoon lingered, a suffocating weight pressing against the log walls. Graham watched her hands. They were capable, scarred, steady. He thought about the $50 he had tossed into the mud in Oakhaven. He thought about the way Cobb had looked at her. He was keeping her, like a prized horse, like a possession. The thought made him sick to his stomach. He had told himself he bought her to save her, to give her shelter. But the truth, the ugly, selfish truth that the prospector's arrival had dragged into the light, was that Graham needed her. He needed her quiet strength. He needed the way the cabin felt alive when she was in it. And that was a debt he had no right to collect. Graham stood up. The sudden movement made Chantal pause, her needle suspended in the air. He walked to the far corner of the cabin, near the foot of the bed. He knelt heavily on his bad leg, ignoring the flare of pain. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt and jammed the blade into the narrow gap between two floorboards, prying upward. The wood popped loose with a sharp crack. Chantal watched him, her brow furrowed in confusion. Graham reached into the hollow space and pulled out a heavy, rusted tin box. He carried it to the table and set it down in front of her. "Leave the coat," he said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. Chantal set the needle down. She looked at the box, then up at his face. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He opened the lid. Inside lay a stack of paper currency and several small, heavy leather pouches. Graham untied one of the pouches and poured a stream of gold eagles onto the scarred wood of the table. The coins clattered loudly. He pushed a stack of 20 coins toward her. $400, Graham said, staring at the gold. "It's enough for a stagecoach ticket from Missoula to San Francisco, or Denver, anywhere you want to go. It's enough to buy a decent boarding room and fresh clothes for a year while you find work." Chantal stared at the money. Her face went pale. The air in her lungs felt suddenly thin, as if she were drowning in the center of the dry cabin. "The snow is gone," Graham continued, his voice monotone, reciting lines he had forced himself to practice all evening. "The passes are clear. Cobb leaves tomorrow. You can ride Barnaby. You can follow him down to the valley. He knows the trails. I'll pay him to see you safe to the railhead." Chantal didn't move. She couldn't feel her fingers. "I bought you to get you away from a bad man," Graham said, finally looking up. The raw agony in his eyes betrayed the flat neutrality of his voice. "I didn't buy you to lock you up in a different cage. You're young. You have your voice back. You don't belong up here in the dirt and the snow with a broken-down old soldier. You have a choice now, Chantal." He pushed the coins closer to her hand. "Take it." Chantal looked at the gold. She looked at the man who had bought her like cattle, who had given her a bed while he slept on the floor, who had let her cut him open and pour whiskey in his veins without a flinch. The man who stood between her and the ugly, grasping hands of the world. He was offering her freedom. He was tearing his own heart out to do it. A slow, burning anger began to knot in her stomach. She didn't want San Francisco. She didn't want Denver. She didn't want a boarding house filled with strange, noisy people. She had been invisible her entire life, a burden, a ghost. Here, in this cabin, she was real. She reached out slowly. Her hand hovered over the stack of gold coins. Graham closed his eyes, preparing himself for the inevitable, preparing for the empty cabin. Chantal's hand closed into a fist. With a sudden, violent motion, she swept her arm across the table. The gold coins flew into the air, scattering across the room with a sharp, chaotic clatter. They hit the stove, bounced off the walls, and rolled into the dark corners of the floorboards. Graham's eyes snapped open in shock. Chantal stood up. The chair scraped harshly against the wood. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce, absolute fury. She walked around the table. Graham took a step back, startled by the sheer intensity radiating from her small frame. She didn't stop until she was inches from his chest. She grabbed the heavy fabric of his canvas shirt in both her fists, pulling herself up onto her toes to look him dead in the eye. "You," she said. Her voice was harsh, tearing at her throat, but it rang out with absolute clarity. "You don't send me away. Chantal, I'm trying to—" "Shut up!" she rasped. The command stopped him cold. She shook him, her knuckles white against his shirt. "I am not a dog. You don't turn me out into the yard." "It's a life, Chantal," Graham pleaded, his hands hovering over hers, wanting to touch her but terrified of breaking the spell. "It's a real life. This is my life." She let go of his shirt with one hand and slammed her open palm flat against his chest, right over his pounding heart. "Here." Graham stared down at her. The cynical armor he wore, the heavy layers of grief and isolation he had built over the years, shattered completely under the weight of her choice. He saw the fire in her eyes, the desperate, angry demand for him to understand. He didn't pull away. He didn't offer any more logical arguments about her youth or his scars. He reached up, wrapping his large, calloused hands around her face. He felt the heat of her skin, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's a hard life, Chantal. It's just me." She looked at him. The anger melted, replaced by a deep, fierce certainty. "Just you," she whispered back. She rose up on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle, tentative thing. It was desperate, grounded, and intensely real. It tasted like bitter coffee and unshed tears. Graham's arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against his chest, anchoring her, finally, to the only place she ever wanted to be. The gold coins lay forgotten in the shadows of the floorboards. Dawn crept over the bitter roots in bruised shades of violet and grey. Graham woke to the unfamiliar, luxurious ache of a soft mattress beneath his spine and the steady, rhythmic heat of Chantal resting against his side. Her head was tucked into the hollow of his shoulder, her arm draped across his chest. She breathed deep and slow. For a long time, Graham just watched the ceiling. He mapped the grain of the rough-hewn logs. He felt the phantom weight of the gold coins still scattered across the floorboards. The cynical, isolated soldier he had been yesterday was dead. The mountain had finally taken him, not with a bullet or a blizzard, but with a small woman who refused to leave. Outside, a horse whinnied. The sound shattered the quiet intimacy of the cabin. Graham's muscles tightened. Cobb. The prospector was still in the lean-to. Graham carefully slid out from under the heavy quilt, easing his bad leg onto the floor. He didn't bother with his boots. He pulled on his canvas trousers, buckled the gun belt over his hips, and grabbed his Winchester from the corner. He unbarred the door with a quiet click and stepped out onto the frost-slicked porch. The yard was empty. The mud had frozen solid overnight, capturing deep, jagged horse tracks. Graham's eyes followed the trail. The roan was saddled and tied to the post outside the lean-to, but Cobb wasn't with the animal. Graham heard the crunch of boots on the icy crust of snow behind the cabin. He moved silently, ignoring the sharp bite of the cold wood against his bare feet. He rounded the corner of the log structure, the rifle raised and seated firmly against his shoulder. Cobb was kneeling by the root cellar door. He had a pry bar jammed under the heavy iron padlock, straining with his entire body weight to snap the hasp. He figured a man living alone in the high country, paying with gold eagles, had a stash buried in the dark. "You won't find gold in there," Graham said. Cobb jumped, dropping the pry bar. It clattered loudly against the frozen earth. He spun around, his hand dropping instinctively toward the heavy revolver holstered on his hip. Graham didn't flinch. He didn't shout a warning. He simply shifted his aim downward and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, a deafening crack that echoed off the granite peaks. The bullet buried itself in the frozen mud exactly 2 inches from the toe of Cobb's right boot, kicking up a spray of icy shrapnel. Cobb threw his hands in the air, his face completely drained of color. He scrambled backward, slipping on the ice and falling hard onto his backside. "Christ!" Cobb yelled, his voice cracking with terror. "Don't shoot! I was looking for a whetstone, for my knife!" Graham jacked the lever of the rifle. The spent brass casing ejected, spinning through the air and landing in the snow with a soft hiss. The sharp, mechanical clack of a fresh round sliding into the chamber sounded incredibly loud in the ringing silence. "You saddle your horse," Graham said, walking forward. His voice was completely devoid of anger. It was a terrifying, flat calm. "You ride down the mountain. If I see you on this ridge again, I won't aim for the dirt." Cobb didn't argue. He scrambled to his feet, keeping his hands high, and ran awkwardly toward the lean-to. He yanked the slipknot loose, vaulted into the saddle, and spurred the roan hard. The horse snorted in protest, kicking up chunks of frozen mud as it bolted down the switchback trail. Graham watched him go until the rider was swallowed by the dense pines. He lowered the rifle. The bitter cold was finally starting to seep into his bare feet. He turned around to head back inside. Chantal was standing on the porch, She wore his oversized wool coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. She held his heavy Colt revolver in both hands, the hammer pulled back, the barrel leveled squarely at the spot where Cobb had been standing. She hadn't stayed in bed. She had heard the noise, found his holster empty, and armed herself. Graham looked at the gun in her hands, then up at her face. Her jaw was set, her blue eyes sharp and unblinking. She was ready to pull the trigger. "He's gone," Graham said softly. Chantal didn't lower the weapon immediately. She scanned the tree line, ensuring the threat was truly neutralized. Slowly she eased the hammer down with her thumb, just as he had taught her during the long winter nights. She lowered the heavy gun, her shoulders dropping an inch. She looked at his bare feet, shivering against the frost. "You forgot your boots," she said. Her voice was raspy, but the morning air carried it perfectly. Graham looked down at his freezing toes, then back at the woman holding his six-shooter. A slow, genuine smile cracked through his thick beard. "I guess I did," he replied. He walked up the steps. She stepped aside, holding the door open for him. He took the Colt from her hands, set it on the table, and pulled her into his chest. She smelled like wood smoke and warm cotton. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his neck. They stood there in the center of the cabin, surrounded by scattered gold coins, utterly indifferent to the fortune beneath their feet. Summer arrived, turning the bitter roots into a lush, unforgiving paradise. The high meadows exploded with bitterroot blossoms and Indian paintbrush. The creeks ran clear and cold, filled with fat cutthroat trout. The harsh, skeletal edges of the mountain softened, and with it, the jagged edges of the people living upon it. Graham swung the heavy splitting maul, bringing it down squarely on a thick round of lodgepole pine. The wood split with a satisfying crack, falling into two perfect halves. He tossed them onto the growing pile against the lean-to. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His bad leg ached, a permanent dull throb that worsened when the summer storms rolled over the ridge. But it carried his weight without a cane. He leaned them all against the chopping block and wiped his brow with the back of his canvas sleeve. "Graham." He turned. Chantal stood on the edge of the porch, holding a tin cup of water. She looked entirely different than the starved, terrified girl he had bought for $50. The mountain air had brought color to her cheeks. The hollows of her face had filled out. She wore a dress she had sewn herself from bolts of calico he had ordered from the Missoula catalog, the blue fabric matching the startling clarity of her eyes. He walked over and took the cup, drinking the cold well water in one long gulp. "Thanks," he breathed out, handing the cup back. She lingered on the step, looking out over the valley. The silence between them was no longer a fortress or a defense mechanism. It was a comfortable, shared space. "We need coffee," Chantal said. Graham looked at her. Her voice had healed significantly. The harsh, scraping rasp was gone, replaced by a low, quiet timbre. She didn't waste words, speaking only when necessary, but she no longer feared the sound of her own breath in the air. "I've got a sack in the cellar," he said. Chantal shook her head. "It's stale! Tastes like dirt. We need fresh." Graham chuckled. "You're getting particular, Mrs. Shaw." She shot him a sideways glance. They hadn't sought out a preacher. There was no paper filed in a county courthouse. They had simply stood on the porch one evening as the sun went down, held hands, and spoken their vows to the pines and the sky. Up here, God heard you just fine without a wooden steeple. "I am particular," she agreed, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I want to go down to Oak Hill, to the Mercantile." Graham's smile faded. He looked down at the chopping block. "Oakhaven," he repeated. The name left a bitter taste in his mouth. He hadn't been back since the day he brought her up the mountain. He remembered the muddy street. He remembered the drunken miners, the noise, the sheer indifferent cruelty of the men who had bid on her like livestock. He remembered Jedediah Edwards's greedy eyes. "I don't think that's a good idea, Chantal," he said quietly. She stepped down off the porch. She walked up to him, placing a hand flat against his damp chest. She felt the heavy, steady thud of his heart. "I'm not afraid," she said. She looked up, holding his gaze with absolute certainty. "He can't hurt me anymore. None of them can. I want to go." Graham studied her face. He saw the iron beneath her skin. She wasn't asking to go into town for coffee. She was asking to go back to the place where her life had ended, to prove that a new one had begun. She needed to walk down that muddy street not as a piece of property, but as a free woman. He covered her hand with his own. "All right, we'll hitch Barnaby in the morning." The ride down the mountain took 4 hours. The summer trail was dry and easy, winding through the heavy timber and breaking out onto the foothills overlooking the settlement. Oak Haven hadn't changed. It was still a loud, filthy, desperate boomtown clinging to the edge of a dying vein of silver. The stench of cheap coal smoke and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the air. Graham pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the mercantile. He tied Barnaby to the rail. He kept his hand resting near the butt of his Colt, his eyes scanning the boardwalk. He walked around the wagon to help Chantal down, but she was already on the ground. She smoothed the front of her calico dress. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, refusing to shrink away from the noise and the stares of the men passing by. They walked up the wooden steps together. Just as Graham reached for the door handle, a man stepped out of the saloon across the street. He was thin, stooped, his clothes ragged and hanging off his frame. He carried a half-empty bottle in one hand, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Jedediah Edwards froze. He stared across the rutted thoroughfare. The bottle in his hand slipped, shattering against the wooden boardwalk. Cheap whiskey pooled around his ruined boots. He recognized the massive man in the canvas coat immediately. Then, his eyes shifted to the woman standing beside him. He blinked, rubbing his face with a filthy sleeve, convinced the rotgut was playing tricks on his mind. The girl was healthy. She was clean. She stood with a proud, unyielding posture he had never seen in his own daughter. "Chantal?" Jedediah choked out, stumbling off the boardwalk into the dirt. "Chantal, is that you, girl?" Graham stepped in front of her instantly, his hand dropping to the iron at his hip. His blood boiled. The urge to draw the weapon and end the miserable man right there in the street was overwhelming, but a hand touched his arm. Chantal stepped out from behind him. She didn't hide. She didn't cower. She looked across the 30 yards of dusty street at the man who had sold her for a rusty rifle and a handful of silver. She saw a broken, pathetic creature. She felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, just a profound, hollow pity. "Chantal!" Jedediah called out again, taking a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling. You look good. You coming home?" Chantal looked at him for a long, silent moment. The busy street around them seemed to quiet down, the town holding its breath. She turned her head and looked at Graham. She saw the fierce, protective fury in his dark eyes, the absolute devotion carved into the harsh lines of his face. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. She turned back to the man in the dirt. "I am home," Chantal said. Her voice carried across the street, clear, steady, and loud enough for everyone to hear. She didn't wait for a response. She turned away from her father, pulled open the door to the mercantile, and walked inside. Graham cast one last, warning glare at the broken man in the street before following his wife into the shop, letting the heavy door swing shut behind them. If you felt the chill of the Bitterroots and the warmth of Graham and Chantal's story, let us know. Hit that like button if you love tales of survival, redemption, and a romance built on action rather than words. Don't forget to share this video with fellow fans of gritty Western dramas, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive, grounded storytelling straight from the frontier. Drop a comment below. Would you have left the gold on the floor? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next trail.